The sleek midnight blue sedan cruised down a quiet residential street, its tires barely making a sound against the pavement. Inside, Isabella Morgan, a 42-year-old black woman with an air of quiet authority, exhaled deeply, savoring the rare moment of peace after an exhausting day. Isabella wasn't just any professional. She was the head of the National Bureau of Investigations, one of the most influential positions in federal law enforcement. Yet tonight, work was the last thing on her mind. She was looking forward to a simple evening, a warm meal, a glass of wine, and a good novel to escape into. The road stretched ahead, mostly empty except for a few scattered vehicles. Her headlights cast long shadows on the asphalt, the rhythmic hum of the engine a steady companion. Then suddenly, the unmistakable flash of red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. A sharp wail of a siren followed, breaking the tranquility of the night. Isabella frowned, her grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. She was certain she hadn't violated any traffic laws. Her speed was within the limit, and every turn had been made precisely. Nevertheless, she smoothly pulled her car over to the side and waited. A moment later, a tall, fair-skinned officer in his early 30s approached. His uniform was crisp, his polished badge catching the dim glow of the streetlights. His name tag read Brian Carter, and his face carried an expression that hovered somewhere between irritation and suspicion. No greeting, no explanation. Instead, Brian leaned slightly toward her window, his gaze sweeping over her car and then settling on her. "You were stopped for security purposes," he stated, his voice flat and impersonal. Isabella sat upright, masking her annoyance with composed professionalism. "Security purposes," she echoed. "Could you clarify what that means exactly?" Brian didn't answer her directly. Instead, he barked, "License and registration." "No." Isabella, resisting the urge to sigh, reached for the glove compartment, retrieving the necessary documents before handing them over. Brian barely glanced at them before walking back toward his patrol car without another word. As she sat in the dim silence, a familiar weight settled on her shoulders. This wasn't the first time she had encountered something like this, being scrutinized unfairly despite everything she had achieved. Even after a lifetime of breaking barriers, moments like this carried a sting that never faded. Brian returned a few minutes later, still holding her documents. "I need to see some additional identification," he demanded, his tone edged with something close to hostility. Isabella raised an eyebrow. "My driver's license and registration are valid," she said, her voice calm but firm. "What's the issue?" Brian's lips curled into a smirk, his posture exuding quiet antagonism. "Just standard procedure," he said. "You driving a car like this at this hour, it's worth checking." Isabella let the words settle before responding. "A car like this?" she repeated, her tone neutral. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Brian crossed his arms, his smirk deepening. "You know exactly what I mean." Isabella felt a flicker of irritation but kept her composure. "Officer Carter, I've complied with the legal requirements. You don't have a valid reason to ask for additional identification." Brian leaned in closer, his voice dropping slightly. "You don't get to tell me what I can and can't ask for," he sneered. "I'm the one in charge here." Isabella met his gaze steadily. "And as someone who knows the law, I also know that what you're doing isn't standard protocol. It's harassment." A muscle in Brian's jaw twitched. He straightened up, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a fight. "Listen, lady," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "I don't have time for this. Either you cooperate, or I'll take you downtown." Isabella inhaled deeply, keeping her voice even. "I won't be intimidated, Officer Carter. You're overstepping, and you know it." Brian scoffed, shifting his weight. His hand drifted toward his belt, where his holstered weapon rested. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered. "I don't like being challenged." Isabella's pulse quickened, but her expression remained unreadable. She slowly reached for her phone, lifting it so that he could see. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Brian snapped. Isabella pressed a button on speed dial and held the phone to her ear. "Calling someone with authority over you," she said, her voice cool and unshaken. The call connected, and Isabella spoke calmly into the receiver. "This is Isabella Morgan," she said into the phone, her voice steady. "I'm being unlawfully detained. I need the chief here immediately." Officer Brian Carter's confidence wavered. "Who are you calling?" he asked, his voice tight. Isabella ignored him, relaying her location before hanging up. She met his gaze. The chief will be here soon. You might want to rethink your next move. Brian's hand hovered near his weapon, but hesitation crept into his posture. This isn't over, he muttered, though his words lacked conviction. Minutes later, the glow of headlights pierced the night. A black SUV pulled up, and Chief Alejandro Ruiz stepped out. His sharp eyes immediately assessed the situation, locking onto Brian Carter. Ruiz, he said, his tone firm. What's going on here? Brian stiffened. Sir, she refused to cooperate. Lower your voice, Ruiz cut in. His gaze shifted to Isabella, registering her calm but assertive presence. Did you pull a gun on an unarmed driver? He asked Brian, his voice dangerously quiet. Brian faltered. I was just being cautious. Or reckless, Ruiz exhaled sharply. Step aside. Brian obeyed, his face paling. Ruiz turned to Isabella. Are you all right, ma'am? I'm fine, she said evenly, but this officer acted unlawfully. A flicker of recognition crossed Ruiz's face. Director Morgan? He asked. Brian visibly stiffened. Director? He echoed weakly. Isabella's gaze didn't waver. Yes, Isabella Morgan, Director of the National Bureau of Investigations. Silence fell. Brian's earlier arrogance evaporated as the weight of his actions sank in. Ruiz's face hardened. Carter, do you realize what you've done? You stopped and harassed the NBI director without cause. This is unacceptable, Brian swallowed. Sir, I didn't know. You were abusing your authority, Isabella interjected. It's not about who I am. This is a pattern that needs to stop. Ruiz nodded. Carter, go back to the station. Submit a full report. I'll deal with you later. Brian hesitated, but under Ruiz's glare, turned and left. Ruiz faced Isabella, regret in his eyes. Director Morgan, I sincerely apologize. This officer's behavior does not reflect our department. He will be held accountable. Isabella studied him for a moment. Thank you, Chief. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure this never happens again. You have my word, Ruiz said. This won't be ignored. Isabella gave a small nod. She knew tonight was just one battle in a much larger fight, one she was determined to keep fighting. As Isabella watched the patrol car disappear into the night, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. The encounter was over, but the weight of it remained. It wasn't just about her title or the fact that she had the power to demand accountability. It was about every person who had been in her position without the privilege of calling for backup, without the protection of a title that made people listen. Chief Ruiz stood beside her, his expression troubled. I meant what I said, he assured her. This won't be ignored. Isabella met his gaze, searching for sincerity. She had heard promises before, seen statements made in public only for injustices to be swept under the rug when the spotlight faded. But tonight, something about Ruiz's eyes, something about the unease in his stance, made her believe he understood the gravity of what had just happened. It can't just be about this one officer, she said. It's about the culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Ruiz nodded. I know, he admitted, and you have my word. I'll take this as far as it needs to go. Isabella didn't thank him. Not yet. Not until action followed. Instead, she gave a curt nod and stepped back toward her car. As she settled into the driver's seat, she caught her reflection in the rearview mirror. Composed, resilient, but undeniably weary. This was just one battle in a long fight, one she had been waging her entire life. But as she gripped the steering wheel and pulled back onto the road, she made a silent vow. Change wasn't just necessary, it was overdue, and she wasn't going to stop fighting until it happened.